on Good Morning America.
Taking a knee, the heads of the Minneapolis Police Department kneeling as the hearse carrying the body of George Floyd passes them by for his memorial today. The whole world is watching. The family of George Floyd remembers the man whose untimely death has sparked a massive movement. Amazing grace. The personal stories amidst the chorus of wake-up calls for civil rights leaders demanding America do better. And the new developments in the investigation. 3 of the ex-officers who were at the scene of Floyd's death in court for the first time today. And Floyd's friend, who was in the car with him before Floyd was killed, now speaking out about what he witnessed. We're live on the ground in Minneapolis tonight with the latest. The attack on police in New York. An officer stabbed in the neck while on patrol. Authorities investigate if the suspect had domestic terror ties. Meanwhile, peaceful protesters continue marching across the country today, thousands taking to the Brooklyn Bridge. The curfew now lifted in the nation's capital. Our team of reporters covering it all tonight. And the latest on the case that first reawakened this country in the middle of a pandemic. Ahmaud Arbery's killers in court today. The father and son who investigators say chased him down and executed him. Waning support after President Trump's former defense secretary blasted his handling of the protest. Republican Senator Lisa Murkowski says she agrees with the criticism. And the tropical storm in the Gulf of Mexico. We'll have the forecast, including the latest on CRISTOBAL.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Lindsay Davis. Thanks so much for streaming with us. We begin tonight right here in Minneapolis, where a massive crowd remains at this hour at the memorial where George Floyd lost his life. Another emotional day of laughs and tears, stirring tributes and impassioned pleas. Thousands in the streets and hundreds in the church to celebrate the life of George Floyd. A community of mourners, certainly a rare sight as COVID-19 rages across this country and the globe. For anyone else who lost their life during this time, they were limited to 10 mourners. In this service, palpable pain that so many across the nation and world are feeling, many here vowing to make sure that his death is not in vain. Today was certainly another busy news day, and the protests continue, but we begin tonight with this homegoing service that was watched around the world.
While thousands have taken a knee in recent days, this time felt different. A powerful moment as the Minneapolis police chief kneeled as George Floyd's casket passed him by. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. Before this 46-year-old became the symbol of a movement, he was a man. At today's memorial service in Minneapolis, we learned about the father and brother from humble beginnings, the high school athlete who loved LeBron James and grew up eating banana and mayonnaise sandwiches.
He was powerful, man. He had a way with words. He could always make you ready to jump and go all the time. Everybody loved George. I'm just, man, it's crazy, man. All these people came to see my brother, and that's amazing to me that he touched so many people's hearts. You know, because he's been touching our hearts, you know. You come to Third Ward, where we're from, people are crying right now. That's how much they loved him.
The thing that I would miss about him most is his hugs. Like, he was this great big giant, and when he would wrap his arms around you, you would just feel like, you know, you were, everything could just go away. Any problems you had, any concerns you had would go away.
Oof. Can y'all please say his name? Thank y'all. Oh my God.
About 200 gathered inside the sanctuary where concerns about the global pandemic were secondary to the outrage.
It was that other pandemic that we're far too familiar with in America, that pandemic of racism and discrimination that killed George Floyd.
The nation getting a glimpse of the black church on any given Sunday as Reverend Al Sharpton gave the eulogy that was as much personal as it was political, even making a dig at President Trump.
Since he held the Bible, if he's watching us today, I would like him to open that Bible. We cannot use Bibles as a prop. And for those that have agendas that are not about justice, this family will not let you use George as a prop.
And the sermon paralleled the life of George Floyd with the struggle of black America.
The reason we could never be who we wanted and dreamed to be in is you kept your knee on our neck. What happened to Floyd happens every day in this country, in education, in health services, and in every area of American life. It's time for us to stand up in George's name and say, get your knee off our necks.
What we endeavor to achieve is equal justice for the United States of America, and George Floyd is the moment that gives us the best opportunity I have seen in a long time of reaching that high ideal that this country was founded on.
And after calls for accountability and change, there was this moment. 8 minutes and 46 seconds of stillness, symbolizing Floyd's final moments.
If we've calculated with the clock here, that's how long he was laying there. There's no excuse. They had enough time. They had enough time. Now, what will we do with the time we have?
While so many here mourn the death of George Floyd, those 3 former Minneapolis officers charged with aiding in his murder, they faced a judge today. They're now behind bars with bail set for $1 million each. What we learned today about their potential defense. Alex Perez files this report.
Tonight, the 3 other Minneapolis police officers charged in connection with George Floyd's death making their first appearance in court. Attorney General Keith Ellison visiting the site where Floyd took his last breaths.
It's about justice on behalf of the people of this state, this country. And that's it.
Those 3 former officers, Toe Tao, J. Alexander King, and Thomas Lane, each facing 2 charges, including aiding and abetting second-degree murder. Attorneys for King and Lane, who were both rookies, shifting the blame to 19-year veteran Officer Derek Chauvin, seen with his knee on Floyd's neck for nearly 9 minutes. King was only on his 3rd shift as a full-time officer, his lawyer said, and that he told the other officers, "You shouldn't do this." Lane's lawyer telling the judge it was his 4th day on the job, saying he asked Chauvin twice, "Shall we roll him over?" adding that Lane performed CPR on Floyd inside the ambulance. Chauvin facing multiple charges, including second-degree murder. And tonight, Maurice Lester Hall, Floyd's friend and one of the people seen in that video just before Floyd's deadly encounter, telling the New York Times, "I'm going to always remember seeing the fear in Floyd's face because he's such a king. That's what sticks with me, seeing a grown man cry before seeing a grown man die."
And Alex Perez joins me now live also in Minneapolis. Those 3 officers were in court today. 2 are claiming that they were just rookies. What else did their lawyers tell the judge?
Yeah, that's right, Lindsay. It seems we learned a little bit about what could possibly be their defense as this moves through the court system. 2 of those officers, Thomas Lane and J. Alexander King, telling the judge today through their attorneys that they are rookies, had only been on the job for about a week as full-time officers, and that they tried on at least 2 occasions as that horrific ordeal unfolded. Right behind me here, they tried at least twice, they told the judge, to stop the other officer, Derek Chauvin, from doing what he did to George Floyd. So it seems here from the court hearing today, Lindsay, that perhaps will be part of their defense going forward. They were rookies. They tried to stop this officer, and he did not stop. Lindsay?
And Alex, what else did we learn today about Derek Chauvin, the officer who was seen with his knee on Floyd's neck?
Well, Lindsay, we learned he had at least 15 complaints over his tenure as a Minneapolis police officer. He was an officer for about 19 years. He was reprimanded during that time only twice. We also learned a little bit more about one of those incidents. A woman accused him of pulling her over for going 10 miles per hour over the speed limit, dragging her out of her vehicle and placing her in a squad car. Now, he was reprimanded for that. He received a letter of reprimand, but that's where that situation ended. Lindsay?
And as far as those 3 officers charged with aiding the alleged murder, what kind of prison sentences could they face?
So those 3 officers, Lindsay, could face up to 40 years behind bars. They are in custody, and right now they're being held on a bail of $1 million. Lindsay?
All right, Alex Perez, thank you so much. And with so much happening here in Minneapolis, we certainly cannot forget about that other flashpoint case that helped re-galvanize the Black Lives Matter movement. The death of Ahmaud Arbery, the black jogger killed on camera, stunning America. As Steve Osunsame reports, we learned many new details in a Georgia courtroom today, including what was allegedly said as Arbery lay dying on the ground.
Testimony from this courtroom in South Georgia says that a racial slur was on the lips of Travis McMichael, who's seen here in this cell phone video shooting and killing 25-year-old Ahmaud Arbery in February. A state investigator says that this is according to neighbor William Roddy Bryan, who's also charged in the killing and recorded the video.
Mr. Bryan said that after the shooting took place, before police arrival, while Mr. Arbery was on the ground, that he heard Travis McMichael make the statement.
Have you seen any other evidence that he has used that horrible N-word anywhere else?
Yes, sir, many times. But one particular one that comes to mind is he made the statement that he loved his job because he was out on a boat and there weren't any N-words anywhere.
This was the probable cause hearing for Brian, Travis McMichael, and his father, Greg, a former police officer, who are all accused in the killing of this young man. The father and son told police they were trying to make a citizen's arrest after seeing Arbery leave this home that's under construction, where people kept coming to look around.
Mr. Travis McMichael used self-defense.
Investigators say that Arbery took nothing. His family says he was out jogging and that the 3 men wouldn't have tried to stop him if he were white. Their lawyer broke down into tears outside the court, explaining how the victim's mother reacted to the racist language.
Being in the courtroom is very hard for the parents right now. They've been doing a great job of trying to control their emotions at the direction of the court. Miss Cooper was sobbing silently to herself. It's very difficult to hear. Excuse me. I can't.
Investigators say that Greg McMichael was using a police-issued gun, even though he retired from law enforcement in June of last year.
And we're joined now live by Steve Osunsame. What was the outcome of today's hearing, and what comes next?
The judge in this case has sided with prosecutors, so this case is now moving to trial. The 3 men have not yet entered a plea, and I will share, Lindsay, that in court, one of their lawyers tried to argue that this racist language is commonly used in the South. Lindsay.
And that alleged racist language, Steve, does that mean that we could potentially see a hate crime charge?
You know, we're not sure about that. We know that federal investigators are looking into this. That actually could be evidence that they could use for a hate crimes charge, but we're just not sure at this point whether that will come to pass. Lindsay.
All right, our thanks to Steve Osunsame. And now I'm going to toss it back to Diane Macedo in New York. So much to get to, Diane. Take it away.
There is, Lindsay, and we will come back to you a little bit later. But right now we're going to go over to Washington, where there's new fallout tonight after former Defense Secretary General James Mattis released that scathing criticism of President Trump, saying he seeks to divide Americans and has made a mockery of the Constitution. Republican Senator Lisa Murkowski now says she agrees with Mattis and that she's now struggling to support the president's re-election. In a tweet, President Trump tonight is responding, saying that he will campaign against the Alaska senator the next time she's running. Here's ABC's News Chief White House correspondent Jonathan Karl.
Outside the White House, new fences, higher barriers, pushing the public back, further separating the president from the world outside. He has been out of sight for 2 days, communicating through his digital megaphone, Twitter. More than 75 tweets since midnight, many of them slogans: "Make America Great Again," "Law and Order." Outside, the protests persisting. Inside the Capitol building, Democratic senators joined together in silence, some taking a knee for 8 minutes, 46 seconds in honor of George Floyd. As the stunning condemnation of President Trump by his former defense secretary, retired General Jim Mattis, reverberates throughout the city. Donald Trump is the first president in my lifetime who does not try to unite the American people, does not even pretend to try, Mattis wrote. Instead, he tries to divide us. We are witnessing the consequences of 3 years without mature leadership. Mattis expressed outrage at the forceful removal of peaceful protesters to make room for what he called a bizarre photo op. Mattis's words prompted a forceful response from Republican Senator Lisa Murkowski.
I was really thankful. I thought General Mattis's words were true and honest and necessary and overdue.
And she offered a pointed message to her fellow Republicans, telling them it is time to speak up. One of the few who did was Senator Mitt Romney.
General Mattis's letter was stunning and powerful. General Mattis is a man of extraordinary sacrifice. He's an American patriot.
Senator Lindsey Graham was among those who spoke in support of the president.
I'm not saying he's blameless, but I am saying that you're buying into a narrative that I think is quite frankly unfair.
President hit back at Mattis on Twitter, calling him the world's most overrated general, adding, "I didn't like his leadership style or much else about him," and many others agree, glad he is gone. Mattis may be gone, but he's not alone in expressing his support for the protesters. On that point, he joins all 4 living former presidents.
Jonathan Karl joins me now from the White House. John, we saw the president's tweets dismissing Mattis, but any concerns inside the White House that Murkowski may just be the first, that this criticism could resonate with more Republicans?
Well, they know that positions are hardened already, particularly among Republican elected officials in Congress. You know, you saw Mitt Romney come out and criticize him. That's not particularly surprising. But I've got to say, the Mattis statement stands out for several reasons, but importantly because he is a revered figure, both among the military and among political figures, and particularly, I have to say, Republicans. He is somebody who is seen as a distinguished figure. He was a real fixture of the Trump cabinet. So, Diane, while it's unusual, unprecedented, I would even go so far to say, to have a former cabinet official, especially one at a top level as a Pentagon secretary, come out and be so harsh about the president he served, calling him a threat to the Constitution, you just don't see that. And add to the fact of Mattis's status, this is a big moment. But again, opinions are so hardened already, it's hard to say whether or not it will have a decisive impact on how Republicans view the president.
And John, speaking of big moments, many Americans tuned in today for the service for George Floyd. The president took some hits during the eulogies. Any message from the president on today's memorial?
The short answer is no. We did not hear at all from the president in person today. As I mentioned, he has been active on Twitter, more than 75 tweets. Not a single one of those tweets mentioned the name George Floyd.
All right. Jonathan Karl from the White House. John, thanks as always. And despite new demonstrations there in Washington, there will be no curfew in the nation's capital. Our Rachel Scott is there.
Hey, Dan. Well, protesters are continuing to gather here at the White House. Just take a look behind me. On that barrier separating these protesters from police, it says, "Our fury is justified." Many here gathering today in honor of George Floyd and demanding for justice and demanding that lawmakers and the president fix racial inequality in this country. A different mood change here tonight. Parts of this street went up in flames earlier this week. St. John's is right there. That's where the president stopped by. We saw those tense and violent clashes unfold thereafter. Parts of this street had multiple fires. Today, a different mood. It was a homegoing celebration for George Floyd. We saw a brass band playing tunes, protesters gathering around in honor of him. And as that memorial service was underway, thousands of miles away, right here in the nation's capital, hundreds of people took a knee. They started with the name of George Floyd, and then they read off the names of other black lives taken by the hands of police. And it really strikes to the heart of the movement that these protesters are out here for. They say the killing of George Floyd was just the boiling point. This is about larger injustice in this country that they want to see fixed. This is about, they say, sending a message to the president about wanting to be heard and sending a message to other lawmakers. They marched on Capitol Hill today as well. And they really say those some odd 9 minutes that the world saw the killing of George Floyd, that the world saw a police officer have his knee on the neck of an unarmed black man, really represented the injustices that exist in America. We are just outside of a White House built by slaves. We're still hearing chants of Black Lives Matter ring out more than 50 years after the Civil Rights Movement. These young protesters say the fight continues. Diane?
Our thanks to Rachel Scott for that report from D.C. And we continue to monitor the confrontations between protesters and police around the country. In Tampa, take a look at these images. That's a woman sprayed in the face as she pleads with officers to get off other protesters that they are pinning to the ground. And we're also taking a look here in New York. Protesters are still outside after that 8 p.m. curfew. These are live images, and we're now hearing reports of a few skirmishes and arrests. But so far, things seem mostly peaceful here in New York City. May they stay that way. Of course, we can't forget that COVID-19 continues to ravage the United States. Nearly 108,000 dead so far, and that number continues to rise. Now, protests are raising new concerns about the spread, with experts warning that some crowd control tools could actually be raising that risk even more. Our David Wright reports on that.
Today on that fatal street corner in Minneapolis, a massive crowd, a show of force against police brutality. These days, there is no safety in numbers. Protest in a time of pandemic is dangerous. But for many, the urgency of a just cause trumps the demand for social distance.
I feel like change is going to come. So whether I'm drained, whether I'm tired, whether I'm sick, I'm still going to come out here because change will come. They'll get tired of us coming out here. They'll get tired of hearing bad things about them.
Cloth masks are a thin line of defense against the spread of coronavirus, imperfect at best. Protesters and public health officials worry about a possible spike.
If you were at a protest, go get a test, please. The protesters have a civic duty here also.
Protesting during a pandemic does carry with it an obvious risk, but there's an added risk that comes from police tactics brought to bear if a peaceful crowd like this becomes unruly, including tear gas, pepper spray, and other irritants, long part of the non-lethal arsenal for crowd control. But experts we spoke to say it's a riskier method right now.
These agents are designed for you to cough and expel from the lung, and they can cause the lungs to constrict. We're focused on COVID-19 risks, in terms of the biology, but also like people coughing, shouting, transmitting virus more. But there are also a lot of non-COVID risks.
Experts say some of these chemicals can increase the risk of spreading infectious diseases, including COVID-19, because they can make people cough, and that spreads droplets. With so many protesters in close proximity during a time when public health advocates are calling for social distance, experts fear that these chemicals could lead to a spike in the weeks to come.
When you have pepper spray or tear gas, it increases the risk of not only potentially COVID-19, but also other respiratory viruses.
Rule 75 of the Geneva Conventions bans the use of riot control agents in warfare. Using tear gas, mace, and pepper spray on the battlefield would be considered a war crime. But in the U.S. and many other countries, it's perfectly legal for law enforcement to use tear gas or pepper spray on civilians. It's also legal in most states for civilians to use pepper spray in self-defense.
If you have a large crowd and you have people in that crowd who are exposed to these chemical agents, there's a high likelihood that you're going to have create the environment where the virus can be spread very quickly amongst that crowd. So law enforcement officials are going to have to think long and hard before making the decision to deploy chemical agents, particularly now that coronavirus has spread across the country.
There's no question police can use pepper spray and tear gas for crowd control. The question is, should they, especially now? Experts warn if it fuels the spread of coronavirus, authorities should reconsider its use. David Wright, ABC News, New York.
And our thanks to David Wright for that report. We're taking it down. With those words, Virginia Governor Ralph Northam announced that the state would take down the statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee. The governor said the statue will be removed as soon as possible and will go into storage for the time being. Terry Moran joins us from Richmond, Virginia now with more. Terry, how big is this moment for not just Virginia, but also the rest of the country?
You know, Diane, it is an important moment, certainly for the city of Richmond and beyond for the country. This imposing statue of Robert E. Lee, the commanding general of the Army of Northern Virginia, the preeminent hero of the Confederacy, has stood here since 1890 along Monument Avenue. And it is a closing of the chapter of how America tells its own history. That myth that the South, the Confederacy, was a noble lost cause, that blood and valor on the battlefield were reconciled in unity after the war. All of that was long seen as essentially a lie that the country told itself to reconcile and reunite after the Civil War, but at the cost of black lives and the equal human dignity of black Americans. This is a moment over the past several years, and certainly today here in Virginia, when those symbols, which were part of the power structure that so many protesters around the country are demanding be changed, are changing. Governor Northam saying this must come down. In Birmingham, taking down a statue. In Indianapolis, the mayor there taking down a statue to inmates, Confederate inmates of a prison there during the Civil War. That statue was established by public officials who were members of the Ku Klux Klan. So the symbolism was enforced essentially by a white terror organization in Indianapolis. And that all is coming together in this week of pain and memory around the death of George Floyd. This is one of the reckonings, one of the many reckonings that the protesters are demanding, that this history be retold, new voices, the truth be told about the country's history. And Governor Northam here deciding to do it. We spoke with Lieutenant Governor Justin Fairfax, who is on the scene here, who has considering running for governor in Virginia next year. And we asked him, how important is it to him that this statue is coming down?
For the Robert E. Lee statue to come down, I think it sends a powerful message about who we want to be going forward. We want to be inclusive. We want to deal with the history of oppression and racism and the Confederacy and all that that represents. And instead, we want to write a new chapter and also dismantling the other living monuments that we have to the Confederacy. And those include our substandard schools, healthcare system, our broken criminal justice system, things that make oppression go down from generation to generation to generation. So we've got to dismantle those as well. But today was a down payment on the promise to do that work as well.
A down payment, the symbolic action that Governor Northam has ordered. Justin Fairfax saying there's a lot of substantive work that needs to be done, but part of it has to do with the past. It was William Faulkner who said the past isn't dead, it isn't even past. And that's one of the things that you can experience here. This has been a focal point of protests here in Richmond. They gather here, march to the Capitol, and today's decision by Governor Northam to bring Robert E. Lee down, well, that is one victory for the protesters here. And
well, Terry, we've
Diane?
seen these, you know, as you're mentioning, we've seen the conversation about statues like that one throughout the country become part of the national conversation. I'm curious how people there are reacting to this announcement there in Richmond.
Well, right now, the people we're seeing are very happy about it because this has been, as I say, a focal point of protests. As we've been here during the course of the day, I haven't seen anyone go by and call out against what's happening here, although we know that Confederate heritage, the understanding of the Confederacy as a noble cause, that is dear to many Southerners. It has been a difficult thing. But I'll say this, since 2015, more than 130 statues commemorating commemorating the Confederacy have been taken down in the United States. What happened in 2015? The massacre of 9 black Americans at Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston. That massacre triggered this reflection, which continues today. Diane?
It does indeed. Terry Moran for us from Richmond, Virginia. Thanks, Terry. And in the Senate today, Senators Cory Booker and Kamala Harris implored their colleague, Senator Rand Paul, to drop his objection to the anti-lynching bill. Paul says he has concerns about the bill, saying that it might allow more minor altercations to be punishable as lynchings. An emotional Booker and Harris then addressed Paul directly on the Senate floor, with many colleagues there watching. Take a look.
To suggest that lynching would only be a lynching if someone's heart was pulled out and produced and displayed to someone else is ridiculous. Senator Paul is now trying to weaken a bill that was already passed. There is no reason for this. There is no reason other than cruel and deliberate obstruction on a day of mourning.
That if we passed this, it would not only do something substantive to make a difference on the books of the American federal system, but God, it would speak volumes to the racial pain and the hurt of generations. I do not need my colleague, the senator from Kentucky, to tell me about one lynching in this country. I've stood in the museum in Montgomery, Alabama, and watched African-American families weeping at the stories of pregnant women lynched in this country and their babies ripped out of them, while this body did nothing. So, Mr. President, I object to this amendment. I object on substance. I object on the law. And from my heart and spirit and every fiber of my being, I object for my ancestors.
Now, the House passed its anti-lynching bill in February by a vote of 410 to 4. It's named in remembrance of Emmett Till. A nearly identical Senate bill then passed in 2019. Paul supported that bill, sponsored by Harris, Booker, and South Carolina Republican Senator Tim Scott. When we asked Scott about this last night, he said, quote, he would love for him to move on the legislation. When we come back, we are continuing to monitor CRISTOBAL out in the Gulf. We will get more on that storm, where it could be heading, and how strong it could be. Also, Meghan Markle speaks out about the unrest gripping America. We'll see what she has to say. And so many companies are now sending messages promoting equality, but what does their leadership look like? Stay with us.
Powerful stories of our time, anytime. Nightline.
Right now, how do you make sense of it all? Now, afternoons on ABC, one place with the good information you need.
We are all in this together, and we're going to get through this together.
Pandemic, what you need to know. Afternoons at 1 Eastern, 12 Central and Pacific on ABC.
We're looking at live images of New York City. Protesters are still out and marching despite that 8 p.m. curfew in the city. We see police following nearby, but so far all seems mostly peaceful. No reports of any violence so far. May it stay that way. And we have breaking news out of Jacksonville, Florida, where multiple firefighters have been seriously injured by a large explosion. More than 120 firefighters have been battling the fire on board a ship that carries vehicles. All of the ship's crew members were able to escape the flames. The fire chief says firefighters are using thermal imaging technology to navigate through that 600-foot ship. And we have more grim unemployment numbers to report. Those released today include another 1.9 million Americans filed for unemployment last week. This means a staggering 42 million Americans have lost their jobs since the start of the pandemic, the highest level since the Great Depression. The one bright spot in those numbers, the worst may be over. Jobless claims continue to fall after peaking at nearly 7 million in the last week of March, so at least those numbers are moving in the right direction. Meanwhile, many corporations are now grappling with when and how to take a stand on social issues. In the wake of massive protests responding to the death of George Floyd, many are now being called to action. ABC's business correspondent Deirdre Bolton takes a look at what companies are saying and, more importantly, what they're doing.
Don't shoot! Hands up! Don't shoot! As tensions flare over the violent arrest and death of George Floyd, protesters are receiving support from an unexpected corner: corporate America. Iconic brands such as Nike, known for speaking out on social justice issues, taking yet another stand against racism and aligning with the cause of Black Lives Matter. The company took a similar position in 2018 through its ad campaign with former NFL quarterback Colin Kaepernick, who went unsigned by the league after taking a knee to protest against police brutality. Several channels owned by Viacom CBS went dark for nearly 9 minutes, symbolizing those tragic moments before Floyd died. Such ads opening the floodgates to other companies that want to add their voice during this difficult national moment. Of course, it's easy to say something, but many are calling for more concrete action. Some companies are doing just that, pledging money to advance diversity within their own organizations and beyond. Disney, the parent company of ABC News, contributing $5 million to social justice organizations, $2 million of which is going to the NAACP. But Disney has its own issues. Last year, Executive Chairman Bob Iger admitted diversity was lacking in company leadership, something he vowed to change before leaving the company. And that's a big issue many companies have yet to address. According to the Center for Talent Innovation, African Americans only hold 3.2% of senior leadership positions at large companies.
Without diverse talent, you're missing out on strong performing talent, but you're also missing out on the diverse ideas that will come to the table when you're having a discussion that will allow you to get to the very best end result for the company.
Even until recently, many companies seem to want to avoid social issues altogether. One possible reason for the change: Millennial and Generation Z consumers taking to the streets in protest.
The younger millennials are going to want to do business with brands that they trust and that they have confidence in. And then the murder of George Floyd in Minnesota, it really started relatively quickly with all sorts of expectations that consumers have that these brands and these CEOs speak up and take a stand.
Millennials also care about authenticity and demand that brands do more than simply jump on a social media bandwagon.
The hashtag Blackout Tuesday gave people a real urgency to say, are we going to take part in this? What are we saying? Are we posting a black square? And some did, got it wrong.
Silicon Valley, home to America's most prominent tech companies, has battled with its reputation of startups and firms run mostly by white men. In response, big tech companies have started releasing yearly diversity reports. At the popular streaming platform Netflix, whites make up 60% of senior leadership, while blacks hold just 8% of those roles. Google's top executives, 65% white. Blacks make up less than 3% of the company's top leadership. And there are currently only 4 black CEOs among Fortune 500 companies. That's less than 1%. In the past 2 decades, there have been only 17 black CEOs in the Fortune 500, and only one of those has been a woman. Most advocates of diversity and inclusion say to invest in their diverse employee base.
You have to move from reacting to reinventing, because all bets are off, right? We are never, ever going back to the way things were. So you need people who are engaged, who are thinking outside the box, if you want to survive and thrive and be successful in the future.
Looking to a future defined by a workforce that reflects the true diversity of America at every level on the corporate ladder. Deirdre Bolton, ABC News, New York.
And we still have more news coming up here on ABC News Prime. We are watching the unrest in Hong Kong, this on the anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre. You may also be surprised by how many people have been arrested in protests here in the United States. But first, our tweet of the day, news of the NBA's return revealed.
Another week in America, a country facing a new test now.
The Wuhan airport, almost no one here.
The last flight out of Rome.
This is the nursing home just outside Seattle. Dozens of people were just rushed off this cruise ship.
This is ground zero.
It is shut down.
Another ambulance just pulled out.
Now they're headed to the hospital.
Time is of the essence.
You can see the ship behind me.
This is the first time tests have been done here.
Morning, afternoon, evening, late night, 24/7. ABC News. There for you.
It's been 10 days since George Floyd's death, and since then, tens of thousands have taken to the streets, most in peaceful protest, some for looting and violence. Here's a look at recent arrests by the numbers. More than 10,000 people nationwide have been arrested in these protests, according to a tally by the Associated Press. More than 25% of those nationwide arrests were in Los Angeles, followed by New York, Dallas, and Philadelphia. About 2,000 have been arrested in New York, and in Minneapolis, where Floyd died, the latest arrest count is 624. And while some officials have said that bad actors are coming in from out of town, the numbers tell a different story. Almost 80% of protesters arrested in Minneapolis were city residents, and 86% of those arrested in D.C. lived in that city or its suburbs, according to the AP. And stay with us. We still have so much to get to. Federal authorities say they could be dealing with a, quote, witch's brew of extremist organizations during this unrest as they investigate a series of attacks on law enforcement. We'll also speak with the Minnesota National Guard on how they're trying to balance protecting free speech while also stopping looting or violence. But first, here are some of the trending stories on abcnews.com.
Seeing right now, this is part of the eye wall.
This procession of migrants goes back 2 miles.
There is going to be catastrophic damage.
This fire has made a run. You can see those flames shooting up into the sky.
We are on the jam-packed red carpet.
To the right, guys.
So this is the 4th weekend of protest.
Watch ABC News on location for Facebook Watch.
An emotional afternoon in Minneapolis. The city mourning George Floyd's killing, hundreds wearing masks, dressed in black, socially distancing inside the auditorium at North Central University. This morning, as the hearse pulled up, the city's chief of police taking a knee as the body of George Floyd passed by. City leaders, family, and friends in attendance.
Everybody wants justice. We want justice for George. He's going to get it. He's going to get it.
Governor Sharpton giving the eulogy.
George Floyd should not be among the deceased. Let us stand still.
The impactful service ended with a moment of silence lasting 8 minutes 46 seconds. That's the same amount of time video showed Officer Chauvin's knee on George Floyd's neck.
There's a hearing today in Georgia for Gregory McMichael and his son Travis, along with William Bryan Jr. They're charged with the death of Ahmaud Arbery, who was followed and shot and killed while he was running.
Today we learned Bryan, the man who recorded video of Arbery's last moments alive, testified to police he heard Travis using racial slurs after Arbery had been shot.
Mr. Bryan said that after the shooting took place, before police arrival, while Mr. Arbery was on the ground, that he heard Travis Michael make the statement.
He also claimed the father-son duo struck the 25-year-old victim with their truck as he tried to run. Meghan Markle is speaking out on the need for change. The Duchess of Sussex breaking her silence on the issue in a speech to her former high school in LA.
The only wrong thing to say is to say nothing. Because George Floyd's life mattered. I am so sorry that you have to grow up in a world where this is still present.
On the anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre, Hong Kong's legislature has passed a bill making it a crime to insult the Chinese national anthem. The bill approved despite opposition from pro-democracy lawmakers who say the law infringes on freedom of expression. Those found guilty face up to 3 years in prison and a fine of more than $6,000.
Still, thousands came in defiance to mark the bloody moment in Chinese history, chanting "Liberate Hong Kong," before police descended, making arrests. Many fear this may be the last commemoration of what happened in 1989, with Beijing imposing a controversial security law banning activities China deems a threat. New Zealand is tackling period poverty, announcing it will now provide free sanitary products to schools for women and girls who may be unable to afford the products themselves. Last year, England announced a similar initiative for high school students, while Scotland works to pass a bill ensuring free products for all.
Here in New York, an investigation is underway after an NYPD officer was stabbed in the neck. 2 other officers and the suspect were injured right after. The FBI is now working to uncover if this could be a case of domestic terrorism. ABC's Chief Justice correspondent Pierre Thomas has more.
Tonight, the NYPD and the FBI trying to determine if an unprovoked attack on officers in Brooklyn overnight is linked to terror. Police say it happened just before midnight. 2 officers were in their cruiser on looting patrol near the protest when the suspect, identified as Janet Kamovic, walked up and stabbed one of them in the neck, just missing an artery. Seconds later, a barrage of gunfire.
They saw the perpetrator with a gun in his hand, which we believe belonged to one of the officers.
Late today, police releasing body cam video of the incident. 2 responding officers shot in the hand. The suspect in critical condition. This large knife recovered at the scene.
Thank God we're not planning a funeral right now.
Across the country, federal officials say they've made more than 50 arrests tied to the protests, ranging from arson to bomb possession, often targeting police.
We are dealing with a witch's brew of a lot of different extremist organizations.
And Pierre joins us now with more. Pierre, with this now the latest example of police officers being attacked, are law enforcement officials planning to do anything differently in response?
Well, they've been deeply concerned about all that's going on, but I can tell you sources say that Kamovic had not been on police radar, but allegedly had associates of concern. But terrorism is just one theory being looked at. Nothing has been ruled in or out. The fear tonight is that bad guys across the spectrum see COVID-19 and tension over Mr. Floyd's death as opportunities for violence, Diane.
A scary thought. Pierre Thomas for us. Thanks, Pierre. Now we're going to head over to Los Angeles, where the mayor last night made a big announcement about the funding of the LAPD. Matt Gutman joins us live once again outside a protest in LA. Matt, tell us more.
Hey, Diane, it was a stunning move because the LAPD was supposed to get a budget increase instead, and perhaps responding to the thousands of protesters who marched right to his very house in the very affluent part of town called Hancock Park, demanding that he defund the police. Just 24 hours later, Mayor Garcetti apparently listening to those words, saying that he's going to slash the police budget by $100 to $150 million. Obviously, major pushback from the LAPD today, but that ship has apparently sailed. So this is the first big hit to policing in America in which the people's words seem to have been heeded by politicians. So a very seismic shift in what we're seeing, and I have to say I was astonished that it came so quickly, but it did come also barely a day after Michael Moore, who was the LAPD chief, basically equated the looters who had been tearing into stores on Saturday and Sunday with the police officers who had killed George Floyd. That created an enormous amount of uproar, and perhaps it was politically expedient for Mayor Garcetti to do the thing he had to do the next day, which is slash the police's budget.
And Matt, we want to show a moment that you had out there last night with actor Kendrick Sampson. Let's listen to what he told you.
That is absolutely not what I'm about, because we don't want anybody to take a knee. A knee does not help me heal from the wounds that they shot me 7 times on Saturday. It does not help my boy who has 2 broken bones in his skull right now because they aimed a cannon at his head with rubber bullets and shot him directly. It does not help this wound on my chest. It does not help the swelling on my arm. It does not help all the batons that hit me and my assistant and split his shin open to the point that he needed stitches when we went to the ER.
Matt, I know that was just a small clip of a much longer conversation, so give us a little more context of what he was trying to say there and how other activists are reacting to officers taking a knee.
So Kendrick Sampson, you might have seen him on Insecure on HBO. He was on How to Get Away with Murder. But he's also an activist. He's a leader in BLM. And he was one of the leaders who took those thousands of marchers literally right to the doorstep of the mayor's house, mansion. And after curfew and everybody had started to disperse, and that was BLM's goal, was to let people go home, the police had taken a step back, really allowing marchers to go almost essentially wherever they wanted. And after it was over, the commander of that area and that scene actually went out to speak with the marchers. And he went arm in arm with somebody. He ended up taking a knee. They ended up exchanging hugs. It seemed to me and many others there like a moment of grace. But as I was interviewing that commander, who's one of the top commanders in the LAPD, walking back, Sampson just jumped into the interview, literally breaking it up. And, you know, I had to go live a few minutes later, a few seconds later, but I came back to Sampson. I wanted to hear what he had to say. And he said, listen, every time you see officers walking with marchers, taking a knee, hugging, it looks good, but it's PR. He called it a farce. He actually said it was disgusting because what it does is damages the ultimate goal, he says, which is changing the way police work. If everybody thinks that police right now as they are and these protesters and marchers can go hand in hand and there can be a meeting of the minds, that is wrong because the status quo, he says, has to change. And every time we see people hugging like that, that's not good. And what you're hearing here is the dissonance between people who are more the Martin Luther King, let's march peacefully, let's, you know, join forces in unity, and then the more strident forces, the more Malcolm X, if you will, like Sampson, who say, no, we need to change things and change them now, and hugging is not going to help. Diane.
All right, we'll fuel a new debate. Matt Gutman for us from LA. Thanks, Matt. Meanwhile, New Orleans Saints quarterback Drew Brees is apologizing today for his comments on the American flag, saying he completely missed the mark. Yesterday, during an interview with Yahoo Finance, Brees responded to a question about players taking a knee during the national anthem, saying he would, quote, never agree with anybody disrespecting the flag of the United States of America. Now, those comments were slammed by a number of people, including LeBron James and Brees' own teammate, Malcolm Jenkins, who called them, quote, extremely self-centered. In a post on Instagram, Brees now says that he was apologizing, or wants to apologize, rather, to his friends, teammates, and the black community, as well as anyone hurt by those comments. He also added that he stands with the black community in the fight against systemic racial injustice and police brutality. And while relations between protesters and law enforcement seems fraught, one Minnesota National Guardsman says he's trying to spread a message of unity. On Monday, during a protest at the state capitol, Lieutenant Colonel Sam Andrews told demonstrators he respects their right to protest. Take a look.
I'm sorry for the loss of George Floyd. All right, my heart hurts as a human being. Last night when I talked to the group out here who peacefully assembled, they peacefully assembled here to have their voice heard. And what we're asking tonight is for the same thing. One of the things that the crowd asked for last night was to have the officers and the Army removed, right? Yeah. So we're off. So for the men and women and children that came out last night to have their voices heard, we heard it. We heard it, and we're going to stay back behind, invisible, so that you can't see us. Is that okay? Yeah.
And Lieutenant Colonel Andrews joins us now. Lieutenant, thank you for being here.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for inviting me on the show to continue the conversation.
It's our pleasure. So I heard you telling those protesters that you wanted to fade into the background. You wanted to become invisible to them. Why do you think it's important for law enforcement to do that right now?
Ma'am, for not just law enforcement, but really for the Minnesota Guard, we're in a period of transition. So we certainly have started to make better choices about how we represent ourselves in the community in terms of lowering our physical presence in the community, as well as lowering the type of equipment that we're wearing in the community. And what that allows us to do is transition really our roles and responsibilities back to local law enforcement.
And you've been out there witnessing these protests. What has it been like for you? What interactions stick out to you?
Yes, ma'am. So, you know, I had some really pretty tense interactions on the 30th of May. I took my helmet and body armor off to engage the crowd, to show them that I wasn't afraid that they were going to hurt me, even though that there were hundreds of guardsmen and state patrolmen in the area, and then listened and conversed and shook hands and asked people to respect the property of the Capitol and respect us and respect one another, and they did. And we listened the next day when the peaceful demonstration came back. They asked to have their voices heard, and we removed our presence from the front of the Capitol.
There's so much debate now surrounding exactly what you're talking about, how law enforcement should be handling these situations. And one of the things you mentioned was the equipment you were wearing. One of the big issues at stake is whether or not officers should be in riot gear, whether that incites even more tension. I wonder from you, what's your advice to fellow law enforcement officials on the front lines right now?
Ma'am, it really depends on the crowd, and it really depends on the individuals that interact with the crowd. The ability to reach across the line and shake hands and introduce yourself starts that conversation. It's really, I mean, it's impossible to do the next thing before you introduce yourself. I found that tremendously successful. Just literally take your glove off and your helmet off and stick your hand out and introduce yourself. I mean, that really speaks volumes about restraint and legitimacy and de-escalation. When you know someone's name, when you introduce yourself, you can actually start the conversation. You can start to listen and hope that you're able to hear what the person standing in front of you has to say.
That's great advice. Well, thank you, Lieutenant Colonel Andrews, for your time and for your work. We wish you luck in keeping the community and those protesters safe. Thank you. Turning now to some pockets of severe weather tonight. A line of storms is making its way through the Northeast right now, hitting many of the same areas that got hit by heavy wind and rain yesterday. Philadelphia is experiencing tornado-like conditions, and we continue to track a tropical storm system in the Gulf. Cristobal hit Mexico earlier today. Our Rob Marciano has more on what we can expect going forward. Hey, Rob.
Good evening to you, Diane. It was rough yesterday across the Philadelphia area, no doubt about that, with that derecho winds of 80+ miles per hour. Some of the same areas are in a watch box tonight for similar type weather, damaging winds and big hail. Some of those areas include just west of Philadelphia in through central Pennsylvania, D.C., Baltimore, back through Pittsburgh as well. And that's one of several pockets of severe weather watch boxes up. There are a couple also in the high plains that we're watching, and they're all in effect for dangerous weather over the next couple of hours. All right, let's talk Cristobal. This is our third named storm of the season already, and it's just the first week of the hurricane season. We got an early start, no doubt about that, and we have some concern with this as it heads towards the U.S. Right now, it's not moving very much. It's over land, over Mexico, and because that has weakened, but we look for it to get into the Gulf of Mexico here over the next day or two and strengthen to a tropical storm once again, and there you see the track. Sunday morning, likely to be in the central Gulf where water temperatures are into the lower 80s, so that should lead to more strengthening. 60 miles per hour will be the sustained winds forecast for Sunday afternoon, making landfall somewhere around Morgan City, maybe Lafayette, and getting up into Alexandria. But here's the thing with this storm. It should be a lopsided storm, so all the action is going to be east of that center line. So places like New Orleans, Biloxi, Mobile, even Pensacola, even much of the state of Florida is going to see a tremendous amount of rain and wind with this. And they have flood watches posted already for southern Florida. Boy, it's been saturated there for a couple of weeks, so you've got more rain coming, and New Orleans already has hoisted a flood watch that's in effect through Tuesday morning. So Cristobal is on its way. We're tracking it. Diane, back over to you.
All right, Rob, thanks. And we're going to go back to Minneapolis for Lindsay's final thoughts in just a moment. But first, here's a look at New York protesters still out past curfew. Stay with us.
Right now, how do you make sense of it all? Now, afternoons on ABC, one place with the good information you need.
We are all in this together, and we're going to get through this together.
Pandemic, what you need to know. Afternoons at 1 Eastern, 12 Central and Pacific on ABC. Friday nights, 9/8 Central. True crime, cinematic, real-life drama, stunning, the unthinkable. Follow the clues. The Hunt. True crime. 2020. Friday nights, 9/8 Central on ABC.
Now let's bring back Lindsay in Minneapolis. Lindsay, being out there, watching the service, now seeing the people at the memorial, you wrote earlier today that it feels different. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, you know, not only does it feel different, it looks different. I mean, if you go back to those images that so many of us have seared in our mind's eye of the March on Washington in 1963, the crowd there, it was predominantly black. Sure, there were white people who were out there supporting and marching, but the crowd was predominantly black. And now you fast forward to 2020, and we are here at the site in front of the place where George Floyd took his last breath, and it's the opposite. The crowd here, for the most part of the day, it's predominantly a white crowd. And again, certainly there are black people, there are non-black people, but it's predominantly a white crowd. And what was also interesting was to watch people who were watching that church service, listening to it on the speakers out here in the street. And people weren't just hearing it. They were active listeners. They were active participants. They were asking questions. They're curious. They're wanting to engage in conversation. They were applauding what Reverend Al Sharpton was saying. They were clapping above their heads. And this just feels different because if you recall, in 2008, so many people said, oh, we're now in a post-racial America now that we have our first black president of the United States. Many people would even take you to task or challenge like the idea that racism existed at this point. And now, today with Al Sharpton, he talked about revisiting those roots of the civil rights movement and going back to marches. And on August 28th, he says that on the 57th anniversary of that original March on Washington, we will march again, though this time he says that the march is going to be led by the Floyd family and the Garner family and any other family that has experienced a similar loss. So really a profound moment here today as people both celebrated and mourned the loss of George Floyd. Now, before we go tonight, the image of the day. And by the way, Diane, thank you so much for all the work that you've been doing there on the desk in New York. But our image of the day before we go tonight, a soldier with the National Guard, fist bumps a protester during demonstrations over the death of George Floyd near the White House. Such a nice, touching moment and something that we certainly hope that we will see more of in the days ahead. That is our show for tonight. Be sure to stay tuned to ABC News Live for more context and analysis of the day's top stories. I'm Lindsay Davis. Thanks so much for streaming with us, and good night.